Welcome back to the FastingWell Podcast and YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be summarizing a book called The End of Alzheimer's by Dr. Bredesen. So to put this in perspective, back in episode 22 of the podcast, I talked about how to prevent and treat Alzheimer's disease. But that was kind of a high-level discussion, hitting some of the most important points based on some podcast interviews that Dr. Bredesen had done and based on his website, and talking a lot about what's called KetoFlex 12.3. So I'm going to include some of that same discussion in today's book summary, because he talks about that in the book, of course, but it's going to go a bit more detail about Alzheimer's, what causes Alzheimer's, why those treatments help, the KetoFlex 12.3 program, and why other treatments help, including other types of medical tests and medical treatments that he recommends or uses, and certain supplements and other lifestyle changes and different things. So it's also going to tell a bit about his story, a bit about the underlying physiology, and a bit about troubleshooting if it's hard to make these kind of lifestyle changes and so on and so forth, and more. Because the book, of course, goes into quite a bit of detail. So I'm going to do it at a high level, though, so I'm going to give you a brief summary of each chapter. It's not going to give you every possible detail, because the audiobook is something like 12 hours long? I can't remember. It's more than 10 hours long, I think, but I can't remember how many hours. But this episode will certainly be shorter than that. Should be shorter than an hour for sure. We'll see how long it turns out. So The End of Alzheimer's. So this was the first book that Dr. Dale Bredesen wrote about treating and preventing or treating Alzheimer's. And then he followed it up a few years later, with one called The End of Alzheimer's Program. So full disclosure, I haven't actually read that book, so I don't know everything that's different about it, but I know that it's supposed to have more practical steps and things like that. So this should give you a good kind of foundation or backstory about what Dr. Bredesen has to share. And then if it's something that you want to dive more into, then maybe your next step would be to go ahead and read that book called The End of Alzheimer's Program and to follow the steps in the program. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. And as always, this isn't just a way to increase your knowledge. It is that, certainly. You can learn a lot from this book or this book summary. But, of course, this is about helping you to have a healthier life, a longer life, a better life. And this can certainly help, because Alzheimer's is becoming extremely common and it's extremely destructive. And so we want to teach you, or teach everyone, teach me how to prevent it if possible and how to treat it if it's started and if it's at a stage where it's potentially reversible. All right, so The End of Alzheimer's. So this book originally came out in 2017. So, of course, Dr. Bredesen has updated some of the info here and there in his subsequent book, but a lot of it's still, applicable. Part 1 is called The Alzheimer's Solution. I think there are 4 total parts in this book. Part 1, The Alzheimer's Solution, Chapter 1, Disrupting Dementia. So in Chapter 1, and I'll occasionally be looking down at my notes here if you're watching the video. So in Chapter 1, he basically explains how Alzheimer's has generally been considered incurable. Like, people thought there's nothing, for decades now, this medical community has kind of approached it as if there is no cure. And so when they've tried to find a solution, it's usually just been one medication, one drug, and that has not worked. Any drugs that are used have modest benefits, if anything, basically, in terms of those single pill kind of things that they've tried to use for Alzheimer's. But Dr. Bredesen and his colleagues have found evidence of improvement or reversal in some cases, and they've been publishing some of those papers. So he's starting to change that narrative, but it's still basically looked at as incurable by the medical community. So in this book, he's going to talk about that whole story. He shares some statistics in this chapter about how prevalent Alzheimer's is becoming. It's super duper common, and it's becoming more common. And that's partly because some of it is lifestyle related, and also because people are living longer than they did 100 years ago and whatnot. So there's various reasons. And he previews the upcoming chapters, how he's going to go over how we got here and the specifics of the program to prevent and treat Alzheimer's disease. So that is Chapter 1. All right, so Chapter 2 is called Patient Zero. And in this chapter, he explains about the first patient, basically, that he kind of treated with this program. And that's because there was a lady, her name was Kristen, who came to talk to him in 2012. And Kristen's mom had died of Alzheimer's. And Kristen was only in her 40s, I believe, and had started to have some of these symptoms of Alzheimer's already. And so she knew what was ahead. She'd seen her mom deteriorate and die of Alzheimer's. And so Kristen knew how ugly the situation could get. So Kristen was actually thinking about committing suicide. But Kristen's friend had heard about Dr. Bredesen and told Kristen she should go talk to Dr. Bredesen. So she did. Now, Dr. Bredesen's program was not ready for prime time because it hadn't really been run through clinical trials and stuff. And that was actually because the institutional review boards, these bodies that kind of approve clinical trials, were not willing to approve the trials because they wanted something simpler, like a simpler solution, like a pill. But the comprehensive program had not yet been tested in that setting. So instead, Kristen asked him a bunch of questions, and he kind of explained all the things that he would recommend she do to treat her Alzheimer's symptoms, her early Alzheimer's symptoms. And she went back home and she did it. And he told her how to work with her doctor and, what to do on her own, but how to kind of get the right testing and treatments through her doctor as well. She did all that stuff, and her symptoms got better. So she was patient 0. So after explaining her story, he goes on to talk about different types of dementia and also the different causes of these different types and how different types kind of respond to different treatments and so on and so forth. He talks about some of the basic physiology, how people often focus on the amyloid plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles, and those are present but not necessarily causing Alzheimer's disease, even though they're present in Alzheimer's disease. And then he also explains that the 3 main causes of Alzheimer's are inflammation, deficiency of nutrients or hormones, and toxins. And by the way, when I did episode 22 of the podcast, I mentioned that the main 2 causes of Alzheimer's were inflammation and insulin resistance, because that's how Dr. Bredesen explained it in some podcasts and things. So this kind of overlaps with that, but is slightly different, because he again mentions inflammation, but he mentions deficiency of nutrients or hormones. So that's related to insulin resistance, because your brain will have kind of an energy crisis when it's not getting enough glucose or not having enough energy sources. And then the third one being the toxins, which wasn't one of those main 2 causes, but it's another significant cause in some cases. And then he talks a little bit about things that they can test for medically and how to kind of treat it with a comprehensive program in a holistic way. It's not just a simple solution. So that is chapter 2, talking again about that patient 0, and then subsequently a little bit about the big picture of Alzheimer's. So chapter 3 is called How Does It Feel to Come Back from Dementia? So the point is, what is it like to get some dementia symptoms and to come back from it? And by the way, dementia is sort of the same thing as Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. So if you weren't sure about that terminology, since we're using the word dementia now, Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, and dementia is where people lose their memory or lose their brain function and so forth. So in this chapter, how does it feel to come back from dementia? So he uses a story about a patient named Eleanor. I think he changed her name to protect the innocent or whatever, but he calls her Eleanor. And he explains all the symptoms that she developed as she was starting to have Alzheimer's. And that included difficulty remembering things, trouble with speech, having trouble driving her car, getting mental fatigue, sleep disruption, and several others. So it paints a picture of just a super disrupted life and lifestyle and not able to do a lot of things. So she was diagnosed at an early age of 49. She had ApoE4. She was ApoE4 positive. Probably double, but I don't remember. And then, in other words, probably 2 copies of that, of ApoE4. So Eleanor then started his ReCoDe program. He calls it the ReCoDe program, with this comprehensive program for treating Alzheimer's. And then within 9 months, she was almost completely better. So amazing transformation. And so then he goes on to describe in detail how each of her symptoms improved and what a big impact that had on her life. So you can imagine if you're having all these different things where you can't remember stuff, you can't drive, you can't, sleep very well, you can't remember people's faces and so on, then all the difficulties. And then as each of those things start to come back to you, what a difference that would make in your life. And so as a specific example, he mentioned how she went to parent-teacher conferences and was now able to actually remember who the teacher was or what they were talking about, where before she hadn't been able to do that. And also that she was fluent in a couple other languages, Chinese and Russian, and had lost that ability because of the Alzheimer's symptoms, and that gradually came back. So that's chapter 3, what it's like to come back, or how does it feel to come back from dementia. So chapter 4 is called How to Give Yourself Alzheimer's, a Primer. So that's a pretty funny title. How to Give Yourself Alzheimer's, a Primer. So in this chapter, he paints a picture of what you can do to give yourself Alzheimer's, but it's also kind of the same thing that many people are doing already. So basically by eating the standard American diet and living the standard American life is how you're going to give yourself Alzheimer's. So he goes into more detail, of course, about what he means by that. So he paints a picture of somebody who eats a sugary snack near bedtime, and so they're having high insulin during the night, and then they don't sleep quite long enough, as many people don't, and then they get up and have some sugary breakfast, like pancakes or toast or who knows, and then they feel stressed while they're driving to work because of the traffic, and then they're kind of rushed at work, so now they're under a lot of stress. And then someone brought muffins to work, so they're eating the muffins, and they have a sandwich for lunch, so they're having the high blood sugar and the high insulin. And then he talks about some of the specific foods and things that cause or that impact giving yourself Alzheimer's, like gluten because it can cause a leaky gut, and dairy because, broadly speaking, dairy can cause inflammation, and then the sugar causing the high insulin and the effects of stress. So he goes into all of that in a bit more detail. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about some of those specific things, like certain foods that contain gluten and whatnot. And then he gets into some physiology that's really interesting, how there's a certain enzyme that breaks down insulin and amyloid, like in your brain, I guess. So this enzyme breaks down insulin or amyloid, and if you have too much insulin, then it's busy breaking down the insulin and can't break down the amyloid, is basically the idea there. So remember, the amyloid is kind of that type of plaque in the brain in people that have Alzheimer's, so that's why that could be significant. He also talks about how being sedentary is part of this, if you want to give yourself Alzheimer's, and how that impacts things like, making you have more overall inflammation and worse health and higher blood sugar and stuff if you're not moving or exercising and stuff like that. So he also goes on to talk about how many of these lifestyle factors contribute to having inadequate certain hormones and stuff, and then also talks about some of the toxins that are generated through, our environment that we're living in and things like that. So certain viruses and bacteria and how those are also causing inflammation and things like that. So it's kind of this whole picture of things that are contributing to Alzheimer's and how our regular American lifestyle plays a big role in that. And he makes the point that if you're living that kind of standard American lifestyle and eating the standard American diet now, even if you don't have Alzheimer's, it's still causing insults to your brain, or in other words, potential damage to your brain, which could increase your risk of Alzheimer's later or just cause other, not so pleasant effects in the short term and the long term. So that is Chapter 4, How to Give Yourself Alzheimer's. Okay, so that was the end of Part 1 of the book. So Part 2 is called Deconstructing Alzheimer's. And so this part explains a bit of the kind of science or physiology and things like that related to Alzheimer's. And so I think he actually introduces this part by saying, if you don't really care about the science, so to speak, then you could skip ahead and just get into the practical steps later in the book. But it's going to kind of tell his story and explain more about Alzheimer's, what causes it, and the different types and so forth. So in Part 2, the first chapter is Chapter 5, Wits End from Bedside to Bench and Back Again. So what the heck does that mean? Bedside to bench. So that's going to refer to, bedside means like if you're a doctor, and bench means if you're a research scientist. So he's talking about some different experiences of that sort. So in this Chapter 5, he talks about his experiences starting in the 1970s in different science labs and different discoveries that were relevant to this whole brain function. And then how he decided to go to medical school, in addition to having done research and stuff, to learn more about brain diseases and be in a position to treat brain diseases. And then ultimately starting a research lab in 1989. And then they talk about a lot of kind of scientific mumbo jumbo, some very specific scientific things that the research that kind of laid the groundwork for this. One interesting thing is they found this apparatus in the brain. The acronym is APP, and it's a dependence receptor for several different hormones and nutrients. What does that mean? A dependence receptor. It means like if those hormones and nutrients or things are present, then something good will happen, and if they're not present, then something bad will happen, or basically. So it's dependent on those things to kind of control what's happening in the brain. And basically, if the right stuff is there and kind of attaching itself to that dependence molecule or apparatus, then it's going to help you have more brain synthesis instead of having more breakdown of the brain cells. So the different ligands, or the different molecules, I should say, not too much jargon here, the different molecules that kind of contribute to breakdown in the brain versus more synthesizing more synapses between the neurons and stuff like that. So that was a big discovery, really significant, because then it started to kind of paint the picture of this holistic approach where you need a variety of different hormones and nutrients and lack of toxins and things for the brain to function properly because of this APP apparatus, or this dependence receptor. He goes on to talk about how Alzheimer's is sort of good in a way because it preserves the most important brain functions. So think about it. If you start forgetting things, you don't remember the TV show you just watched, but you are still able to breathe because your brain's still controlling your breathing, just as an example. So it kind of keeps you alive while preserving the important parts of the brain when your brain is not in a condition to be able to function well. So it's kind of like a triage where you're preserving the most important things. So going on, he talks about how there are about, 36. Yeah. He's like, you have to patch 36 different holes to be able to treat Alzheimer's. And so that's why one pill is never going to do it, because there's all these different factors that play into it. And he uses a roofer analogy. So if you had a hailstorm and a bunch of holes in your roof and you just patch a few of them, you're still going to have a bunch of water leaking in, obviously. So he again mentions how they weren't able to do the clinical trials to test his program because the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, wanted a simpler solution, like a pill. But you can't treat this with just one pill because you got to patch 36 holes, not just one hole. So it needs a comprehensive approach. So that was the end of chapter 5. And then we get into chapter 6 called The God Gene and the 3 Types of Alzheimer's Disease. So what is chapter 6 about? So it's basically about some of the physiology related to Alzheimer's and then the different types of Alzheimer's. So in Alzheimer's, you have too much breakdown in the brain and not enough synapse formation. And ApoE4 can play a role, and that's why if you have this ApoE4 gene or genotype or phenotype, if you have the gene or if you have that in your body, then you're more prone to getting Alzheimer's because it decreases amyloid clearance for some reason, and then that shifts the balance towards degeneration in the brain. Because remember that dependence receptor, so there's various things that are going to kind of shift the balance one way or the other, and ApoE4 is one of those. So targeting ApoE4 alone is not enough because it's part of a bigger picture, bigger puzzle, but it's one of the significant things. So the different types of Alzheimer's. So the first one is what he calls hot or inflammatory. That's type 1, and that's associated with ApoE4. So ApoE4 it's kind of a lipoprotein thing. So it's not really a brain molecule per se exclusively, but it has a big impact on the brain. So again, this type 1, the hot type, associated with ApoE4, and if you have 2 copies of ApoE4, also known as homozygous, then you probably get Alzheimer's in your 40s. And if you have 1 copy or heterozygous, then you would tend to get Alzheimer's in your 50s. And if you have 0 copies, then you might be someone who gets Alzheimer's in your 60s or 70s or possibly even later. The second type of Alzheimer's is he's going to call it atrophic, meaning that there's inadequate levels of different hormones and trophic factors. And there's also so those different hormones, like testosterone and estrogen or, growth hormone or like a lot of different things that he'll kind of list later. He's saying there's a type 1.5, which is a combo of the first 2 types, and he calls it glycotoxic. It includes inflammation as well as insulin resistance. So the insulin's not working as well in the brain, so you kind of have an energy crisis, but there's also inflammation at the same time. Type 3 is atypical and doesn't affect memory as much. It's more about cognitive function, being able to think and reason and that sort of thing. He says it's often misdiagnosed as something like vascular dementia or frontotemporal dementia. And then he gives some other characteristics as well, how this could have high copper to zinc ratio, maybe low thyroid, etc. And then that type 3 is associated with various potential toxins and tends to get better with toxin removal like mercury or lead, even though the scientific community doesn't seem to agree that toxins are a potential cause of Alzheimer's, but he's observed that sometimes it gets better when you remove those toxins. So that's the end of part 2, where he was talking more about the scientific underpinnings or the physiology related to Alzheimer's. So then we're going to get into part 3. Evaluation and personalized therapeutics. So in some ways, this is probably the part you would be the most interested in because it's going to get into very specific and practical steps related to testing and then treating to prevent or treat Alzheimer's. So within this part, he goes over what he calls the cognoscopy in chapter 7, and then the ReCoDe program in chapter 8, and then there's one additional chapter. So let's talk about the cognoscopy. Where do you stand? That's chapter 7. The cognoscopy, where do you stand? So cognoscopy, of course, if you hadn't figured it out, is a play on words related to colonoscopy, because colonoscopy is very well known to basically everyone as something that you're recommended to do around the time you turn 50, give or take. The guidelines are shifting as time goes on. And that's to look for signs of colon cancer because they're putting a camera in your colon. So the cognoscopy is to check your cognitive function or status or whatever through a variety of tests that'll look at many different things. So this chapter is very detailed, and so if you really want to get into it, you got to look at the actual book, but I'll share a few things. So he says you should get a cognoscopy if you're 45 or older, especially if you have a family history of Alzheimer's. This is in stark contrast to the typical approach to testing and treatment for Alzheimer's, which is basically not much testing at all. Just kind of saying, oh, looks like they're getting Alzheimer's, and then they kind of go downhill gradually. And then they do some very limited treatments and stuff like that. So he goes over a long list of different vitamins, minerals, medical tests related to things like blood sugar, insulin, hormones, and then all these optimal ranges for all these different things. It's a pretty long list. And he also explains how each of these things is related to cognitive impairment or brain not working as well. He also covers some different toxins and how they affect Alzheimer's and how to test for each of them. Also different microbes, in other words, things like bacteria or viruses and how they can cause inflammation, and then also leaky gut. And he weaves in several patient stories to kind of show how these different things are relevant to brain function and how people have gotten better when they've treated these types of issues like low levels of different vitamins and minerals or high levels of certain toxins or other things causing inflammation and so on. So a lot of detail, and so you'd have to review it for all the specifics. Some examples of the other things, specifics I haven't mentioned, are talking about vitamin B12 and vitamin D and zinc to copper ratio. I mentioned blood sugar and insulin, sex hormones, mercury, arsenic, gut permeability, and the list goes on. And then also sometimes imaging tests like the functional MRI and things like that. So the cognoscopy, that's chapter 7. That's kind of a hint or a teaser or an overview of it, what it is, but of course can't go into all the details because it's so much. All right, so chapter 8. So after the cognoscopy, then it's time to treat what you found in the cognoscopy, and that's why chapter 8 is called ReCoDe, which means reversing cognitive decline. So sort of an acronym, except it's 2 letters from each word. Reversing cognitive decline becomes ReCoDe. So you're going to recode your brain. So basically, this is his program, his treatment for Alzheimer's, to prevent or reverse Alzheimer's. So this chapter has a bunch of specific recommendations about nutrition, supplements, exercise, sleep, and so on. It's pretty detailed. And so, of course, I won't be able to cover everything. Now, to name a few specifics, he talks about homocysteine and how to treat that if you have high levels, and then things like fasting insulin. And by the way, this is the chapter where he gets into what's called KetoFlex 12.3. And that's what I talked a lot about back in episode 22 of the podcast, and also on a blog post that I did and a YouTube video. So KetoFlex 12.3 is part of his ReCoDe program. And what does it mean? So KetoFlex means you get into ketosis regularly. That's the keto part. It means, he says flexitarian, meaning it's flexible about how much meat and stuff, but he'll give specific dietary recommendations about what to avoid and what to eat. The 12.3 means fasting at least 12 hours overnight, so including the time that you sleep. So if you sleep for 8 hours, you have an additional 4 hours at least. So you're fasting 12 hours overnight, and at least 3 hours after your last meal before bedtime. That's where 12.3 comes from. So he explains why that is helpful, because you're basically giving yourself a chance to let the blood sugar normalize after you're done eating for the day. The insulin can normalize. You have the intermittent ketosis because ketones are good for the brain. And also you're preventing some of the inflammation that happens with high blood sugar and certain types of food and things like that. Because part of KetoFlex 12.3 is avoiding the sugar, avoiding grains, and avoiding conventional dairy. And then he gets into the specific things that you will be eating, such as moderate protein, healthy fats, certain types of fat to help you boost your ketones, like MCT oil or coconut oil, that you maybe then switch later to a lower saturated fat type, especially if you're ApoE4 positive, but you start off with that to help boost your ketones, and then avoiding those specific foods that I mentioned. So that's kind of what KetoFlex 12.3 is. And then one thing I didn't mention is that it helps you be able to have some autophagy in your brain because of the 12-hour overnight fast each day. So have at least a little bit of autophagy going on in the brain, which is that kind of cellular spring cleaning that happens when you don't eat for a while. All right. So he also goes on to talk about generally some supplements that he generally recommends, as well as specific supplements for troubleshooting certain issues. He talks a lot about how to improve sleep, because sleep is really important for your brain. And then he discusses in detail the effects of stress and how to reduce stress. He also talks about leaky gut and how to treat that, and the microbiome and different ways to address that if needed. Talks about optimizing different hormones, including thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, and others, and treatments related to each of these. So it's a lot of details, and so that's just kind of a high-level overview about all the different stuff that's in this ReCoDe program. So that was Chapter 8. ReCoDe, kind of the most practical and action-oriented chapter. And then in some of the subsequent chapters, he'll talk about how to really put that in practice and what to do if you're not able to perfectly put it in practice. All right, Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called Success and the Social Network, 2 People's Daily Routines. So in this chapter, he shares 2 specific people and their daily routines in detail, like exactly what they're doing to put this ReCoDe protocol in practice. So one of these two people is Julie, or wait, was it Julie or Kristen? Sorry, got the name wrong. But one of them is Julie, and she was mentioned earlier in the book. I may have gotten confused about the different names, but regardless, Julie is somebody who was ApoE4 positive ×2, and therefore had a high risk of Alzheimer's and was probably having some early Alzheimer's symptoms like in her 40s. Yeah. So it walks through exactly what she does every day to put ReCoDe in practice. And that includes, but may not be limited to, food timing. So she does the time-restricted eating, 15 or 6 hours of fasting every day. It talks about what she eats. So that's going to be the moderate protein, healthy fats, lots of fruits and vegetables, which, by the way, is part of KetoFlex 12.3, since I didn't really mention that in the last chapter. A variety of fruits and vegetables, not the highest sugar fruits necessarily, but a variety of vegetables, fruits, some different supplements, how she exercises. Exercise is also part of the ReCoDe protocol, if I didn't emphasize that or mention that in the last chapter. Sleep hygiene, how she improves her sleep, and certain medications that she's using. So she is basically going full court press, doing everything that she can do to treat her Alzheimer's, and is kind of almost perfect at doing it. And that's partly because she has a genetic, disadvantage because of her ApoE4, 2 copies of ApoE4. And so it's an uphill battle for her. So she kind of has to do everything to really treat this effectively and to keep up with it. So she's doing all this different stuff. Now, the next person that he shares in detail is a different routine that's definitely not as perfect, not as comprehensive. So that person is doing some of the things that he recommends, but not all of them. So that includes 12 hours overnight fasting, avoiding gluten, some medications and supplements, some exercise. And then he mentioned some ways her routine could be better, but it's still working okay for her reasonably well. In this chapter, he also talks about a social network that Julie started for ApoE4 positive people, and how it's kind of like some online chat thing or whatever, and how they were able to kind of help each other and share information that they learned and so on and so forth. And it's an example of how people can work together to overcome challenges, even if the medical community doesn't give them any hope. So the medical community was way behind on this one, but they were kind of figuring it out, and Dr. Bredesen was figuring it out, and so forth. So that is Chapter 9, Success in the Social Network. So a quick side note, I realized that I might have skipped over some of the stuff in the ReCoDe chapter because there's so much, and not really emphasized exercise and the exact types of food and things like that. But if you want more information about that, you can either read the book, listen to my previous podcast where I got into that a little bit, or go to Dr. Bredesen's website. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to Part 4, Maximizing Success. So the first chapter in Part 4 is called, it's Chapter 10, called Putting It All Together. You can do it. So that's Chapter 10. So in this chapter, he summarizes the ReCoDe protocol in a table. So he kind of goes over it again. So if you get the actual book, which I have it here, but I don't think I showed it at the beginning, then it has some various tables and charts and things that are useful, since there's a lot of kind of detailed minutia to sort through in terms of the specific medical tests and then the specific treatments and so on and so forth. So he talks again about ReCoDe, and he mentions that the program is not easy. A lot of people cheat or make excuses and aren't willing to stick with dietary changes or other steps. Because, of course, we all have our our habits and our lifestyles and our addictions and things that make it hard for us to sometimes change. We have other pressures and time constraints and so forth that can make it challenging. And so if you're not consistent, it may not work. Even when it works, it typically requires additional troubleshooting and optimization. So it's not going to be just flipping a switch. It's going to take some time to get things figured out, and then you'll probably have to do some troubleshooting, and you have to be consistent. Just like with fasting, as I've talked about elsewhere, you got to be consistent for a while to really see the impact. Same thing would be true with this very comprehensive program to prevent or treat Alzheimer's. I mean, certainly if you put some of the steps in practice, that's better than nothing. But if you are one of those people who's at a high risk of Alzheimer's, or you already have it, then you got to do more than just a few of the steps to really treat it effectively. It's a marathon, not a sprint, so you got to stick with it for a while or forever. And the program tends to work better in people who are a little younger, who are not as severe yet. In other words, you want to do early prevention rather than waiting until it gets bad. It helps if you have a supportive family and a supportive healthcare team. And some doctors are not receptive because what they learned in medical school is that this is basically incurable. So if you stop the program, it may only take a couple weeks for the symptoms to get worse, and that's possibly because of something called immune memory, maybe the inflammation comes back quickly in certain areas and various things like that. And he talks about how his mindset has changed a lot over his career, because he would have thought it was crazy if you had told him a few decades ago that he would be emphasizing things like meditation and fasting and sleep, because he kind of thought of those as more of kind of, I don't know, like not really part of what a doctor does, if you had said that to his younger self. So that is chapter 10, putting it all together. So next is chapter 11, called This Is Not Easy, Workarounds and Crutches. So again, this is a comprehensive program, so it's not necessarily going to be easy to put it into practice. And so he has some workarounds or some ways that you can make it easier, or as temporary replacements, or this and that. So he goes through some of the common complaints, objections, or excuses that people make about not being able to follow the ReCoDe protocol, like not wanting to give up junk food or being too busy. And he addresses those, like what he would say about each of those, in terms of, like either you got to make a sacrifice and do it, or there may be some slight alternative way that you can do it, or whatever. So he kind of gives some different suggestions. He answers some common questions about soy, aluminum, vaping, and so on, like in terms of whether those things matter to this whole treatment protocol and to Alzheimer's. And he provides some alternatives, like I was saying, like for different treats and foods and stuff. And so he suggests some specific ways to reduce cravings. By the way, that includes L-glutamine supplement, MCT oil, drinking water, and exercising are some of the examples of things that will reduce cravings, and other tips and tricks. So he mentions that biological urges are useful, like when you get hungry, thirsty, you need to sleep, etc., but to ideally stick to the ones that are compatible with evolution. So in other words, he's kind of talking about what was helpful for your ancestors to survive and reproduce. Those are the urges that you want to kind of stick with, as opposed to the ones that just make you diabetic, like eating a bunch of junk food, because that can become an urge, but it's more of an addiction when the brain is kind of dysregulated. Ultimately, you have to prioritize and focus on your new vision, including the joy you will get from a healthier life with better brain function. So you want to focus on the future and that positive outlook of what you can accomplish, as opposed to just focusing on, I have to give up pizza. So yeah, you would have to give up pizza to follow the ReCoDe protocol. So yeah. So, I mean, it's a sacrifice, but is it worth it if the alternative is to have Alzheimer's and not be able to recognize your grandkids, and, not be able to drive or sleep well, and then ultimately just turn into kind of a dysfunctional human being? All right, so that was chapter 11. This is not easy, workarounds and crutches. Okay, so the last chapter, this is the last chapter, and then there are some appendices. So the last chapter is chapter 12, Resistance to Change. Machiavelli meets Feynman. All right, so resistance to change. So you can kind of tell a little bit what that would mean. Because this whole approach is very new, it's not quite as new now in 2025 as I'm talking about it. The book came out in 2017 originally, but it's still pretty new. But there's a lot of resistance and simple-minded responses about how this can't be right. It can't be working. The results aren't real, and it needs to be simpler, or it won't be FDA approved, and so on, as I talked about earlier. So these simple-minded responses come from patients, scientists, doctors, administrators, and others. So he addresses a bunch of common questions in this chapter, common concerns, like patients who want to wait and put it off until their symptoms really get bad, or saying that they already eat healthy food. Is gluten really harmful, or is it just a fad? And the program isn't working right away, and many others. So he addresses all those things. So of course, the first question there, like wanting to wait until the symptoms get bad, prevention is better than treatment for just about anything. So you want to do it early and often, especially if you're at high risk due to family history and other things like that. Now, he talks about how medicine has evolved, the medical field has evolved, because in the 20th century, a lot of stuff we learned how to treat was with monotherapy, like an antibiotic for an infection, because penicillin was discovered in the 20th century, and then that evolved to become all these different antibiotics. But more complex diseases are showing up now because people are living longer and because of lifestyle changes. So these more complex diseases include Alzheimer's, includes diabetes, includes heart disease. And so these don't just require one monotherapy like a pill. They require a comprehensive approach to treat effectively. Okay, so we're basically done, but let's hit the appendices. So Appendix A is a summary of foods to eat and foods to avoid. So I kind of explained this as I was going through, but in case it wasn't clear, or in case it's helpful to kind of review, in summary, he has a table in the book where he has like green light, yellow light, red light in terms of what to eat plenty of, what to avoid, and what you can have some of. But basically he emphasizes having a lot of non-starchy vegetables, so several different types, high fiber foods, healthy fats, which if you don't know what that is, I've got some podcast episodes that cover that. Wild-caught fish, which are specifically the ones that are the smash fish. So I think that stands for salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and actually not sure what the H is, maybe herring or something. But anyway, you can look up what the smash fish are, but definitely salmon and sardines. And then moderate protein from well-raised beef and chicken, and limited low glycemic fruits. So fruit, yes, but not the most sugary fruit necessarily. Avoiding gluten, avoiding dairy, at least most of the time. Avoiding grains because they have the gluten and, are going to raise your blood sugar a lot. Avoiding sugar and other simple carbs or refined carbs. And avoiding high mercury fish like tuna. So it's the moderate protein from good sources, the healthy fats, plenty of fruits and vegetables, but not too sugary, and avoiding those specific things, the sugar, the gluten-containing things like grains, and the conventional dairy, because those either raise blood sugar a lot, or they cause leaky gut, or they cause inflammation. So that's basically what to eat and what not to eat, except if you want more specifics, then check out Appendix A in the book. Appendix B is about ketone meters, because he talks about getting into ketosis on a regular basis. And so you want to have a ketone meter, at least initially, or some way of measuring your ketones. So if you want to use the blood meter, then he mentions the Precision Extra as a possibility. The strips are a little expensive, but cheaper in Canada, apparently, he mentions. And you don't have to keep checking it forever once you get into the swing of things if you learn how your body responds to different foods or different conditions. So he recommends trying to get into a level of 0.5 to 4 on the ketone scale. So that's the ketone meter details in Appendix B. Appendix C is about having your 23andMe data evaluated. So if you do genetic testing and want to learn about ApoE4. So he kind of walks you through the process, but also mentions that I think 23andMe stopped checking ApoE4 data, but then started again. So you'd have to look up what the current situation is with that. I'm not completely sure. All right, so Appendix D is more info about the ReCoDe protocol, or in other words, to say this better, if you want more info about the ReCoDe protocol, go to his websites, and he lists some of his websites. And one of them is drbredesen.com or dalebredesen.com, something like that. All right, so that is a high-level summary of The End of Alzheimer's. So while this is a pretty long discussion, it'll be well under an hour once I edit it down. I can see it's quite long right now, but I had to pause in between chapters and stuff. So it'll be well under an hour, whereas you would take about 12 hours or maybe more, I can't remember, if you listen to the whole audiobook, and then probably more than that to really kind of digest all the information. So this is to give you kind of a teaser, kind of an overview of what it might take if you're one of those people who is at high risk for Alzheimer's or already has some of the symptoms, or you have family members that fall into that category. And of course, even if you're not one of those people and you want to just put some of these steps into practice so that you can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, then that's a good idea, obviously, because neurodegenerative diseases are one of the big 3 or so things that kind of make people's lives go downhill or kill people nowadays, along with heart disease and cancer. So yeah, but obviously if you're one of the people that really needs to put all this in practice, then get yourself one of these books, and you can just go with the most recent book, which is The End of Alzheimer's Program. All right, so that's all for now on the FastingWell Podcast and the YouTube channel. So if you want to dive into more detail about some of the stuff I was talking about, take a look at the previous episodes where I talk a lot about things like fasting, where I talk about KetoFlex 12.3, where I talk about healthy fats, where I talk about a lot of other things. And I'll see you next time on the FastingWell Podcast.